This is the remains of Aloha Airlines Flight 243. About 20 minutes into its journey, a large chunk of the fuselage tore off, subjecting the passengers and crew to explosive decompression and exposure to the elements at 24,000 feet. So, what happened to them?
Hello, 243, can you give me your souls on board and your fuel on board?
We, 86 plus 5 crew members.
Roger, how many do you think are injured?
We have no idea. We cannot communicate with our flight attendants.
Okay, we'll have ambulance on the way.
Aloha Airlines was an American airline company headquartered in Hawaii, USA. On April 28, 1988, they had scheduled Flight 243, taking passengers from Hilo on Hawaii Island to Honolulu on Oahu. The flight would be the sixth that day for the assigned Boeing 737, and it would also be its last. Flight 243 never made it to Oahu. The captain was 44-year-old Robert Schornsteimer. The first officer, 36-year-old Madeline Tompkins. With 3 flight attendants on board, the crew totaled 5. There were 90 passengers. As they were boarding, one passenger noted a crack on the outside of the fuselage to the right of the entry door. She assumed that if it were visible to her, then the qualified technicians and engineers would have been well aware of it, and thus it wasn't a problem. This passenger was mistaken. As it later turned out, Aloha Airlines had a whole fleet of planes that were in desperate need of thorough maintenance and repair. This was despite the fact that their engineers conducted inspections more frequently than Boeing recommended in relation to the plane's flight hours. Boeing recommended what's known as a D-check every 20,000 flight hours, but Aloha Airlines performed one every 15,000 hours. So how then did the planes fall into such disrepair? This is because the number of flight hours aren't necessarily what wears down an aircraft. The cabin of a plane like the 737 is essentially a large pressure vessel. It's pressurized during ascent and depressurized during descent. This pressurization cycle causes stress and fatigue to the construction of an aircraft as the components expand and contract with each cycle, eventually resulting in pieces needing repair and replacement. This was a problem for Aloha Airlines, as their flights between the Hawaiian Islands were very short, meaning they racked up pressurization cycles at an incredible rate when compared to their flight hours. In fact, at this point in time, Aloha Airlines operated the 2 highest pressurization cycle 737s in the world. This aircraft was number 2. In just 35,000 hours of flight, this plane racked up nearly 90,000 pressurization cycles, more than double than it's designed for. Flight 243 departed Hilo at 1:25 p.m. About 20 minutes later, the aircraft is southeast of the island of Maui at an altitude of about 24,000 feet. Although the fasten seatbelt light was still on, the flight attendants were already serving drinks, a usual occurrence because the flights were so short. Lead flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing was handing a drink to a passenger at row 5 in first class when suddenly there was an explosion and she was gone. An 18.5-foot section of the fuselage had torn off, sending debris everywhere and explosively decompressing the cabin. Everything on board was now being sucked towards the gaping hole. This force would literally take the air out of your lungs. Clarabelle Lansing was standing right beneath the now open roof and had been dragged out to her doom. Flight attendant Jane Sato Tomita had been hit by flying debris and knocked unconscious. Luckily, her limp body became trapped in debris and she remained on board the flight. Flight attendant Michelle Honda managed to survive by holding onto the supports for the seats. Explosive decompression can only last for so long though, and once the air from the cabin had escaped, the air from outside the plane started to come in. Passengers that were suspended in place only by their seatbelts were now slammed back into place. A thunderous roar of freezing winds battered them at hundreds of miles an hour. Trying to breathe at this altitude was a big problem, and one with no solution, as the delivery system for the oxygen masks had been taken out in the explosion. Michelle Honda tried her best to console passengers. Some were injured by debris, all were panicked. Over the noise of the air rushing into the cabin, she heard someone ask if the pilots were still in control of the plane. She didn't know if they were. In fact, she didn't even know if they were still in the plane. She ran for the crew phone at the back of the plane, but couldn't get in touch with the cockpit because the line had been severed. Panic now overwhelming her, she began to ask passengers if they knew how to fly a plane. Captain Schornsteimer and First Officer Tompkins were indeed still on board. They looked behind them to see the cockpit door was missing, and beyond that, they saw part of the roof had been replaced with sky. Although they couldn't see just how extensive the damage was, they decided to make an emergency landing on Maui.
Maui Tower, Aloha 243, we're in dock for landing. Descending out of 13, and we have rapid depressurized. We are pressurized, declaring an emergency.
Hello, 243, clear your position.
Pressurized into Maui for landing. Request the equipment.
243, the equipment is on the roll. Plan straight in runway 2, and I'll keep you advised on any wind change.
We're going to need assistance. We cannot communicate with the flight attendant. We'll need assistance for the passengers when we land.
Okay, I understand you're going to need an ambulance, is that correct?
Affirmative.
Hello, 243, can you give me your souls on board and your fuel on board?
We, 86 plus 5 crew members.
Roger, how many do you think are injured?
We have no idea. We cannot communicate with our flight attendant.
Okay, we'll have ambulance on the way.
Okay.
The captain began to rapidly descend, trying to get everyone to a more hospitable altitude as quickly as possible. This had two unintended consequences. Many passengers thought the plane was now falling out of the sky, and more importantly, an incredible amount of stress was now being placed on what remained of the first class section. Schornsteimer was unaware that the cockpit was connected to the rest of the plane by 18 feet of floor. Passengers watched on in horror as the floor sagged and buckled. As the captain came to the final approach for the emergency landing, a number of things compounded his already loose control of the aircraft. Firstly, the light for the nose landing gear wasn't coming on. Whether this was a fault with the nose gear itself or just the light was a mystery, but if there was no nose gear, there was no chance Schornsteimer or Tompkins would survive this landing. Second, the left engine had failed, having eaten debris from the initial explosion. But with the runway in sight, Schornsteimer had bigger worries, like the flaps on the plane. Tompkins had put them to landing position, but had to put them back when it made the plane near uncontrollable. Without the flaps, they were coming into land at very high speed. As the plane came into view of the airport, onlookers dropped to the ground upon seeing the state it was in. The air traffic controller was able to visually confirm to the crew that the nose gear was down. And then, the plane landed safely. The ordeal had lasted 13 minutes. 65 were injured, some seriously, although Maui was unprepared for an emergency of this nature. The island had just 2 ambulances, and the air traffic controller had actually forgotten to call one. Instead, a tour company provided its tour vans to evacuate the injured, and some of its drivers, who were former paramedics, established a triage on the runway. The crew wondered where flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing had gone, although a bloodstain on the outside of the craft gave a bleak indication. The 58-year-old was a veteran flight attendant of 37 years. She was pronounced dead, although her body would never be found. The detached piece of the plane's fuselage would also evade detection. This gave experts called in to investigate some trepidation. If the section was missing, it would be impossible to tell how it failed. However, after seeing the craft, the entire thing was in such a shocking state that it was easy to see how any of it could break. If this plane hadn't had this accident, it would still have required a year's worth of repairs. Now, it was only fit for the scrapyard. Aloha Airlines was criticised for their poor maintenance protocols, and inspection of the rest of their fleet revealed more planes had to be scrapped or repaired. They overhauled their maintenance program, and the FAA adopted much stricter protocols to ensure no other airline would have such a disaster under their watch. Although it would never fly again, it's amazing this aircraft made a safe landing. A picture alone is enough to tell you how proud the crew should be for being able to land it, and how terrifying the whole ordeal must have been for everyone on board, all but one of whom survived. They were thrashed around, showered in debris, exposed to the elements at an altitude where the air is thin, and they all would be forgiven for believing they were doomed, because rightfully they were. Really, what Schornsteimer and Tompkins did was conquer reality. They brought them back from the brink and ultimately saved them their lives.
Well, it sounded like an explosion, but probably more like rapid decompression.
I saw that the plane was disintegrating. I saw that there was absolutely no hope that we were going to land. The pilot did something that was unbelievable in bringing that airplane down. And a plane like that should not fly.